This podcast will describe how to conduct a peer and self-review of the discussion section. The discussion section should begin with a complete and correct summary of the results. In order to determine what the correct summary of the results were, either read through the results section or look at the summary that has been provided to you by your instructor. Whichever is available, please look at. Make sure you understand the results, and then read the first paragraph of the discussion section to make sure the results for each independent variable that was looked at are summarized in this discussion. Also, make sure that the writer addressed whether their hypotheses were supported by the results. Let's look at an example. Again, from that same student paper we've been looking at. And if you notice, this student does indeed talk about the three variables that they studied and summarizes whether they were significantly related to depression and in which direction. First, the writer explains there was no significant correlation between physical activity and depression. Then the writer addresses the second survey question and says there was also not a significant correlation between amount of time spent on inactive behaviors and depression. The writer then concludes that these do not support their hypothesis. However, their third variable was significant, and here she found a positive correlation between number of inactive hours on the weekend and depression. And finally, the writer states that this last analysis partially supports their hypothesis. Here we have a clear, succinct summary of the results of the analyses and how these relate to the hypothesis. Next, the discussion section should review the research articles discussed in the introduction and discuss how the findings of those three articles relate to the findings in this study. Again, let's look at the example from the student paper. The writer takes each of the studies that she had summarized in the introduction and relates those to her findings. First, she identifies what they had in common. They both studied sedentary behaviors and depression. Next, the writer identifies that her study looked at the relationship among college students, where the Azari study had looked at the relationship among children and adolescents. The writer also notes that the Azari study looked at several mental health outcomes, whereas the present study only looked at depression as an outcome. Then the writer notes that the findings from the present study are not consistent with the Azari study. The author then goes on to discuss the other studies in the same manner, summarizing what the studies had in common and how they differed, and summarizing how their results were similar or dissimilar. So, as a reviewer, please assess whether the author accurately understood the three research articles and accurately applied their findings to the findings of those articles. Pause and return to this podcast after you have evaluated these three aspects of the discussion section. Next, if the findings did not support the hypothesis, then the author must identify why that might be the case. Was their hypothesis incorrect? Was there a problem with the way they assessed the hypothesis? Was there a problem with the sample? These are the issues that must be looked at if a hypothesis was not supported. Let's look at the student example again. And here we see the student addresses possible reasons for the hypothesis not being supported. One issue that the student brings up is that the questions on the survey may not have been adequate. Specifically, subjects might have misinterpreted the question because there were several data points that didn't make sense. For example, some students answered 40 for a question that says, how many hours does a subject exercise in a day? And there may also have been problems with the way that subjects interpreted certain aspects of the question. For example, here, again, they may have only interpreted strenuous working out as being physical activity and not other activities such as walking. So the student determined that the hypothesis still may be correct, but that the questions her group wrote may not have been adequate to test that hypothesis. Now pause this vodcast, and if the hypotheses were not supported in the paper you're reading, read over the paper and identify whether the author adequately addressed reasons why that hypothesis might not have been supported. The next thing to evaluate is whether the author identified relevant and important weaknesses in the study. Now clearly, the study conducted in this class has very limited generalizability. We can't generalize from this convenient sample of Hope students and Friends of Hope students to any type of general population, and that's obvious. So certainly that must be identified as a weakness, but I would like the writer to think more deeply about their paper, about the questions they asked, about how they tested their hypothesis, and come up with other important weaknesses in the study. No study is perfect, and it is important to think critically about the study that has been done. In the example that we have been using, the student has already identified some of the weaknesses in the study. The student talked about the fact that the questions were ambiguous and easily misinterpreted. Look over the study you're evaluating and note whether the student has thought deeply about their study and how it was conducted and the questions they asked, and identified important weaknesses other than the generalizability of the sample. Pause this podcast and turn it on again when you are done evaluating whether important weaknesses have been identified. And finally, the paper should conclude with meaningful research that should be conducted next. This should tie into some of the issues that have already been identified. Any important weaknesses that were identified earlier in the paper should be expanded on in this section. For example, if one of the weaknesses of the study was that the questions were worded poorly, then in this next paragraph, the writer should propose what types of questions should have been asked instead or should be asked in the future. Or if the hypotheses were supported in this paper, then the author must think about what would be the next steps to look at if one wanted to further study the hypothesis that was proposed. Let's look at this example of the student paper again. Here the student states, to expand on this study, it would be interesting to observe if there is any difference in correlation between sedentary behavior and depression between college students and those who graduated from college several years ago. So here the student suggests that the study could be expanded on by looking at a population of people who have graduated from college, so a different age range, people in a different phase of life. Further on, she proposes the idea of looking at the relationship between stress and sedentary behaviors and how those together relate to depression. This is the section of the paper where you can think more deeply about what you've looked at and what would be the logical next step. Pause this podcast and make sure that the writer has looked critically and thought creatively about the next step in this line of research. Now, hopefully, as you've been evaluating this paper, you've been noting areas where the paper was not concise enough, where it was unclear, or where there were grammatical problems. Now you can also give some summary ratings on the conciseness, clarity, and grammar of this paper. So be sure to mark whether these issues with writing were good, fair, or poor. And then finally, going back over the paper, note whether the student used proper APA format. For example, when citing a paper, the appropriate APA format is to use the author's last names followed by the date in which the paper was published. And there are two ways that this can be done. The two examples here are in red. Also, look at the reference section. First, ensure that the 3 articles that have been referenced in the introduction are in the reference section. Also, make sure that the reference for the depression measure is in the reference section. Or if any other articles or texts were referenced in the introduction, such as the Kessler article or the textbook you use for this class, those should also be in the reference section. And make sure that when they are referenced, the author used appropriate APA format. And you can see highlighted in yellow what the appropriate APA format reference should look like. Okay, this concludes the final podcast in instructing you on how to conduct a peer and self-review. Thank you for your time.